It was a late afternoon in early spring, the kind of day that starts warm but turns chilly when the sun begins to set. The streets were busy with people rushing home from work, horns blaring, lights flickering from shop windows. Among the crowd walked a young woman who blended easily with everyone else. She wore a faded coat and carried a worn-out bag over her shoulder. Her shoes were old but clean, and her tired steps showed she had been on her feet since morning. She worked long hours at a small cafe, serving customers with a quiet smile that hid her exhaustion. Most days she barely made enough to cover her rent and send a little money to her mother, who lived in a small village outside the city. Still, she never complained. Life had taught her that complaining didn't change anything. What mattered was doing what you could, even when no one noticed. As she walked down the main road that evening, she thought about the long list of things she needed to do: buying groceries, paying the electricity bill, maybe finding a second job. The traffic lights changed from green to red, and cars stopped in neat lines. She crossed the street carefully, her thoughts miles away, until a sharp sound snapped her back to the moment. A loud crash echoed across the road. It was followed by the screeching of tires and the sickening sound of metal twisting against metal. People turned instantly. Just a few meters ahead, a shiny black car had slammed into a lamppost on the side of the road. Smoke started to rise from under its hood, dark and thick. At first, no one moved. People stood still, some with their phones out filming. The young woman froze too, her heart racing. Then she heard something that cut through the chaos: a child's cry. It came from inside the car. Her body reacted before her mind could. She dropped her bag and ran toward the wreck. The closer she got, the stronger the smell of burning fuel became. A man nearby shouted to stay back. It could explode. But she didn't stop. Her hands trembled, but her legs kept moving. The car's front door was smashed in and smoke filled the inside. She could barely see through the cracked windows, but she could hear the cries clearly now. Small, frightened, desperate. It was a toddler trapped in the back seat, buckled into a car seat that was surrounded by spreading flames. Her heart pounded in her ears. She tried pulling the back door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, coughing as the smoke stung her eyes. She glanced around, spotted a piece of broken metal on the ground, and used it to hit the window. It didn't break at first. She hit it again and again until the glass cracked. "Someone help me," she shouted, her voice hoarse. A man finally ran over, helping her clear the shattered glass. Together they pulled at the door until it gave way slightly. The heat was unbearable now, and she could feel it on her face. Flames were crawling closer from the front of the car. The child was crying uncontrollably, his small hands reaching out in fear. She reached in through the smoke, coughing, her fingers fumbling with the seatbelt. It was jammed. She tried again, but it wouldn't loosen. Her heart raced faster. She could barely breathe. She remembered a trick from a video she once saw. She pressed the belt release while twisting it slightly, and suddenly it came free. She grabbed the toddler and pulled him out just as someone behind her shouted, "Get back, it's going to blow." She stumbled backward with the child in her arms, running as fast as she could. A few seconds later, a loud pop burst from the engine, sending sparks into the air. The crowd gasped. She dropped to her knees on the sidewalk, coughing and shaking, still holding the child tightly. The little boy was crying but alive. His small face was covered in soot, and his tiny hands clutched her coat. She pressed him against her chest, whispering softly, "It's okay. You're safe now." People gathered around, some calling for an ambulance, others just staring. The man who had helped her stood nearby, wide-eyed. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. Her mind was blank except for the sound of the boy's breathing and the faint sirens growing louder in the distance. The paramedics arrived quickly. One of them took the toddler from her arms carefully while another checked her burns and bruises. She shook her head when they asked if she wanted to go to the hospital. "I'm fine," she insisted, even though her hands were red and trembling. "Just take care of him." As the ambulance doors closed and sped away, she stood by the roadside, still in shock. People came up to her, praising her bravery, asking for her name, some even taking photos. She felt embarrassed by the attention. She didn't feel like a hero. She was just glad the child was safe. She walked over to pick up her bag, which was now covered in dust. Her jacket smelled like smoke and her throat burned when she swallowed. The sky had turned orange with the setting sun, and the streetlights began to flicker on one by one. As she continued walking home, the world around her seemed strangely quiet. Every sound felt distant, the hum of cars, the chatter of people, even the breeze. She thought about the child's terrified face, those small eyes staring at her through the smoke. It would stay with her, she knew, for a long time. When she finally reached her apartment building, she sat on the front steps for a while to catch her breath. The neighbors passed by, nodding politely. None of them knew what had just happened. She smiled faintly at the thought. How life could change in seconds, how something so terrifying could happen on an ordinary evening. Inside her small room, she took off her coat and placed it on the chair. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, clinging to her hair and skin. She washed her face and looked in the mirror. Her reflection looked tired but different. Her eyes carried something new, a strange mix of fear and calm. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the events replayed in her mind, again and again. She wondered about the child, if he was okay, if his parents were with him now. She hoped he wasn't too scared anymore. She whispered a small prayer before closing her eyes, thankful that the boy had survived. The next morning, she woke up sore. Her arms ached from pulling the car door and her throat still hurt from the smoke. But she got up anyway and prepared for work. Life had to go on. At the cafe, everyone was talking about the accident. Her coworker showed her a news video on his phone. "Did you see this?" he said. "Some woman rescued a rich man's little boy from a burning car yesterday. She's a real hero." She froze, watching the short clip on the screen. The video showed a blurred image of a woman pulling a child from the smoke, people shouting, and then the car bursting into flames. The caption read, "Unknown woman saves businessman's son from fiery crash." Her coworker sighed. "People like that are rare," he said. "I wonder who she is." She smiled faintly, pretending not to know. "Yeah," she whispered. "She's brave." Then she turned back to her work, pouring coffee for a customer, but inside her heart felt heavy. She didn't do it to be seen. She didn't want praise or recognition. She only wanted that little boy to live. Later that day, as she left work, she noticed a sleek black car parked near the cafe entrance. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his face pale but determined. He looked around as if searching for someone. Their eyes met for a brief second, though she didn't know yet that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. She turned away quickly, not wanting to draw attention. She had no idea that the man she saw was the father of the child she had saved, a man whose next words would soon change everything for her. That night, as she walked home again, she glanced at the street corner where the accident had happened. The burned marks on the road were still visible, faint but real. She stood there for a moment, staring at them quietly. The traffic lights blinked red and green just as before. As if nothing had ever happened, she whispered softly to herself, "I hope he's okay," before walking away into the night. She didn't know that in another part of the city, that same rich man was looking at a photo of her taken from the scene. The woman who had risked her life for his son. And he had already decided he would find her no matter what it took. The next morning started quietly, just like any other. The young woman woke early, dressed for work, and packed her small lunch. But something inside her felt unsettled. The memory of the burning car, the frightened child, and the rush of people still played in her mind like a movie that wouldn't stop. She had tried to forget, but some things leave marks that don't fade overnight. At the cafe, the usual customers came in for their coffee and breakfast. The sound of cups clinking and the smell of roasted beans filled the air. She moved from table to table, taking orders and smiling politely, just as she always did. Yet every time she looked out the window, she caught herself scanning the street as if expecting something, or someone. Around noon, the cafe bell rang, and a man walked in. He was dressed neatly in a dark suit, his face calm but serious. He looked slightly out of place in the small, cozy cafe. The young woman noticed him right away because of the way he carried himself, not proud, but with a quiet confidence that drew attention. He walked up to the counter and asked softly, "Do you know a woman who was at the accident yesterday evening? The one who saved the child?" Her heart skipped. She froze behind the counter for a second before managing to answer, I don't know." "Why?" The man gave a small, polite smile. "I'm looking for her. My son was the child she saved." The room went silent for her. She could hear the hum of the coffee machine, the faint chatter from the tables, but her thoughts blurred. She didn't know what to say. After a moment, she simply nodded and whispered, "It was me." The man looked at her for a long second, studying her face as if trying to believe it. She stood awkwardly, her apron dusted with flour, her hands still slightly red from the burns. Finally, he said quietly, "I thought I'd never find you." She didn't know how to respond. "I'm glad your son is safe," she said softly. He looked down, his voice trembling slightly. "You saved his life. The doctor said if you hadn't pulled him out when you did, he wouldn't have survived another minute." She lowered her eyes, embarrassed. "Anyone would have done the same," she murmured. He shook his head. "No, they wouldn't. People watched, but you ran into the fire. That's not something everyone does." She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to being noticed, especially not like this. He took out a small card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Please let me thank you properly. Come by my office when you have time. I'd like to talk." Before she could refuse, he nodded politely and left, leaving her standing there with the card in her hand. The gold letters on it showed the name of a large company she had heard of before. She tucked it quickly into her apron, afraid the other workers might see. The rest of the day passed slowly. Her co-workers whispered and teased her gently when they realized who the man was, but she tried to ignore them. When her shift ended, she walked home, the card still in her pocket. That night, she sat on her bed and turned it over in her fingers again and again. Part of her wanted to go see him, maybe just to make sure the child was really fine. Another part of her felt nervous. People from his world didn't usually talk to people like her, but curiosity and concern won. The next morning, she took a deep breath, dressed neatly in her cleanest clothes, and took a bus to the address written on the card. The office building was tall, its glass walls shining in the sunlight. She stood outside for a while, feeling small and unsure. The security guard at the front desk asked her name, then made a quick call before telling her, "He's expecting you. Please go to the top floor." Her palms were sweating as she stepped into the elevator. When the doors opened, she found herself in a quiet hallway filled with soft light. A woman at the reception desk smiled and guided her into a large office. The man was already standing by the window, looking out over the city. He turned when she entered and gave a warm smile. "I'm really glad you came." She nodded nervously, not knowing where to sit until he gestured toward a chair. "Please make yourself comfortable." There was a moment of silence before he spoke again. "My son is recovering well. He keeps talking about the lady who saved him. He says you held him and told him he was safe." Her lips curved into a shy smile. He was so scared. "I just wanted him to stop crying." The man sat down across from her. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said seriously. "If it weren't for you, I would have lost him." "He's all I have." She shook her head quickly. "Please don't say that. I didn't do it for any reward. I just did what felt right." He admired her honesty. Most people he met wanted something from him, but she didn't. That made her even more remarkable. "Still," he said, "you risked your life. You deserve something in return." She hesitated. "I don't want anything, really." He studied her for a moment. Her clothes were simple, her hands rough from work, yet her eyes carried a quiet strength that impressed him deeply. "Then at least allow me to help you," he said gently. "Do you work full-time at that cafe?" She nodded. "Yes, it's enough for rent, mostly." He thought for a moment, then said, "I could offer you a position at my company. Something simple at first, assistant work maybe. You'd have better pay and you'd be closer to the people who truly appreciate what you've done." She stared at him, shocked. "I don't have experience for that kind of job," she said honestly. "You have the kind of courage and heart money can't buy," he replied. "We can teach you the rest." She didn't know how to answer. A small voice inside her told her it was too good to be true. But another voice whispered that maybe this was her chance, a door she never expected to open. He smiled kindly. "Take your time to think about it. No pressure. My offer will stay open." When she left his office that day, her head was full of thoughts. The street seemed brighter, but her heart felt heavy with confusion. She had never asked for help in her life. She had always survived on her own. But what if this opportunity was something meant for her? That night, she told her mother about the offer over a phone call. Her mother listened quietly, then said softly, "Sometimes kindness brings unexpected blessings. Maybe this is one of them." The next morning, she made her decision. She went back to the company, nervous but determined, and accepted the offer. Her first days were difficult. Everything was new. Computers, schedules, people speaking in polite, hurried tones. She made mistakes, apologized often, and stayed late to learn. Yet she noticed the man always treated her with patience and respect. He didn't speak to her like an employer to an employee, but like someone who genuinely cared. Sometimes his young son would visit the office. Whenever he saw her, he'd run up to her and hold her hand tightly. "You saved me," he'd say with a shy smile. She'd laugh softly and reply, "You were very brave too." Days turned into weeks. Slowly, she started to feel like she belonged there. Her co-workers began to notice her calm nature and her willingness to help anyone who needed it. People liked her, though she never tried to stand out. One evening, as she was about to leave, the man called her into his office. He thanked her for her hard work and handed her an envelope. "Your first full salary," he said with a smile. "You've earned it." She took it with trembling hands, whispering a quiet thank you. On her way home, she stopped by a small store and bought groceries she had never been able to afford before. Then she sent a small package to her mother with a note that read, "Things are getting better now." Life, for the first time in years, began to feel lighter. Yet somewhere deep down, she often wondered why this man, this wealthy, respected man, had gone out of his way for her. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe something more. But she never asked. All she knew was that one moment of courage had opened a door to a life she never imagined possible. And though she didn't realize it yet, her story with this man and his little boy was only just beginning. The path ahead would test her heart in ways she couldn't yet understand. But for now, she walked home with a quiet smile, knowing that sometimes life rewards those who act with kindness, even when no one is watching. The weeks passed quietly, and she settled into her new job. The office still felt a little intimidating sometimes, but she was learning fast. Every morning she arrived early, neatly dressed, ready to do her work. People around her had started to respect her for her kindness and focus. She wasn't loud or overly confident, but there was something genuine about her that made others comfortable in her presence. The man often watched her from his office. He noticed how she never complained, even when tasks were difficult. She helped everyone who needed assistance, whether it was carrying files, staying late, or making coffee when others were too busy. She reminded him of something rare, a person who cared without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, his little boy came to the office with his caretaker. The child had recovered fully, but he still clung to his father's hand whenever they walked. The moment he saw her, his face lit up. He ran straight toward her, calling out happily. She turned, surprised, and knelt to greet him. The boy threw his small arms around her, resting his head on her shoulder. "I missed you," he said softly. She smiled and hugged him back. "I missed you too. How have you been?" He started talking about his toys in school, his words spilling out in excitement. The man watched them from a distance, something warm stirring in his heart. His son had not smiled this much in months. The woman's presence seemed to bring peace to both of them. From that day on, whenever the boy came to visit, he spent most of his time near her. Sometimes she'd sit with him in the small office lounge, telling stories or helping him draw. She treated him like he was her own family, and he adored her for it. One evening, as she was about to leave, the man stopped her. "Would you mind joining us for dinner tomorrow?" he asked kindly. "My son won't stop asking to see you outside of work." She hesitated at first. "I don't want to intrude." "You won't," he said with a gentle smile. "It would make him happy." "And me too," she finally agreed. The next evening, she arrived at their home, a large, elegant house on a quiet street lined with trees. She stood outside the gate for a moment, feeling nervous. A house like that seemed like another world compared to her small rented room. But the door opened, and the boy came running out with a huge grin. "You came," he shouted with joy. His father followed behind, smiling at the sight of them. "Come in, please. You're part of the reason this home still feels alive," he said sincerely. Inside, the place was warm and beautifully decorated, but it didn't feel like she expected. There was no arrogance or coldness, just a quiet sadness hidden behind the expensive wall. The man's wife had passed away years ago, and since then he had buried himself in work. The boy had grown up with caretakers and teachers, but little warmth. That night was different. The table was set simply, and laughter filled the air as they shared stories. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like a home. After dinner, the boy fell asleep on the couch while she was reading him a story. The man watched them quietly, his heart full of gratitude. "You've brought something back to this house," he said softly. "Something I thought was gone forever." She looked up, smiling shyly. "I didn't do anything special." He shook his head. "You did more than you realize." From that day on, her visits became more frequent. Sometimes it was dinner. Other times it was just to drop off a small gift for the boy. She didn't have much money, but she'd bring him simple things: a storybook, a wooden toy, a drawing she made herself. The boy would beam every time. The man noticed her simplicity and sincerity in everything she did. She never asked for anything, never acted impressed by his wealth. To her, people mattered more than money, and that touched him deeply. As months went by, her life began to change quietly. She grew more confident at work. Her salary allowed her to move into a slightly better apartment. She was able to send more money to her mother, and even start saving a little. Yet she remained humble and kind, always grateful for what she had. Sometimes late at night she would think about how strange life was. Just one decision, running toward that burning cart, and had changed everything. She wondered if fate had meant for her to cross paths with this family. One weekend she received a call from the man. His voice sounded different, a little tired. "Could you come by the house today?" he asked. "I'd appreciate your company." When she arrived, she noticed he looked pale and worn out. He had been working too hard again. She insisted he rest, and while he did, she spent time with his son, keeping the boy busy so his father could sleep. When he woke up later, he found her in the kitchen helping the house staff prepare dinner. "You're not supposed to work here," he said with a smile. She laughed softly. "I like helping. It reminds me of home." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her move around the kitchen. There was a calmness about her that filled the space like sunlight. He realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. As the days went by, she became an important part of their lives. The boy began to see her as family. Once he asked innocently, "Can she stay with us forever?" The question made both adults smile, though neither answered. People at the company started noticing their closeness, whispering quietly, but he didn't care. He knew her worth went far beyond what anyone could understand. She wasn't just an employee. She was someone who had risked her life for his son and brought warmth into a place that had been cold for too long. One afternoon during a light rain, he found her standing near the office window, watching the city. "You seem deep in thought," he said. She smiled faintly. "I was just thinking how strange life can be. I used to walk past buildings like this and wonder what people inside were like. I never imagined I'd be here one day." He looked at her for a moment before saying quietly, "You earned your place here. Don't ever think otherwise." His words stayed with her long after that conversation. She had spent most of her life believing she was invisible, but for the first time she felt seen. As months turned into a year, her bond with both father and son grew stronger. The boy often fell asleep while she told him bedtime stories, and the man sometimes joined them, just listening in silence. Those quiet evenings became moments of peace that all three of them cherished. But even in those peaceful times, she sometimes felt uncertain. The world she lived in now was so different from the one she came from. She worried that one day it might all disappear, that she'd wake up and find it was just a dream. One night she sat alone in her room, looking at an old photograph of her mother. She whispered softly, "I don't know why things happen this way, but I hope I'm making you proud." Meanwhile, across the city, the man was thinking about her too. He had everything money could buy, but it was her presence that had brought true meaning back into his life. Her honesty and courage had reminded him what really mattered. The next morning when she arrived at work, he called her into his office. "I have something for you," he said, handing her a small envelope. She opened it slowly and found an official letter. It was a promotion. She looked up in surprise. "I don't think I deserve this yet," he smiled warmly. "You've earned more than that. You've brought trust, peace, and care into this company, and into my life." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "No, thank you. You remind me every day that kindness still exists in this world." That evening, as she walked home through the quiet streets, she felt a deep sense of peace. Life hadn't been easy, but somehow every struggle had led her here. She had saved a child, but in a way she realized they had saved her too. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She had people who cared, a purpose that mattered, and a heart full of gratitude. As she looked up at the stars that night, she whispered softly, "Maybe this is what it means to be blessed, not by luck, but by love." She had no idea that even bigger changes were waiting for her, changes that would test her courage once again, not in fire, but in the quiet choices of the heart. Time moved quietly, like soft waves touching the shore. It had been more than a year since the day she had rescued the child from that burning car, but to her it still felt like yesterday. The memory came back sometimes, especially when she looked at the boy's smiling face. He had grown taller, more confident, and happier. Whenever he saw her, his eyes sparkled with the same warmth she had seen that day when she carried him out of danger. Her life had changed in many ways. She had a steady job now. Her small apartment felt like a real home. And her mother often said on the phone, "You sound happier these days." But more than anything, she felt like she finally belonged somewhere. The man and his son had become her closest circle. They were like family, even though none of them ever said it out loud. Sometimes when she sat with them at dinner, she felt a strange comfort, as if life had silently rewarded her for all the difficult years she had survived. But deep down, she also carried a quiet worry. She often told herself that good things don't last forever. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was because she had seen how life could change in a single moment. One morning she arrived at the office early. The man was already there, looking over some files. He looked tired. His face showed the weight of too many responsibilities. When he saw her, he smiled faintly and said, "You always come early. You should rest more." She smiled back. "You say that every day, but you're here before me." He laughed softly. It was one of those small moments that made them both forget the world outside. A few days later, a big project came into the company. It was an important deal, and everyone was working long hours. She stayed late every night, helping wherever she could. The man noticed how hard she worked, but also saw the exhaustion in her eyes. One evening, when almost everyone had gone home, he walked into her office and placed a cup of tea on her desk. "You need a break," he said gently. She looked up, surprised, and smiled. "You shouldn't have." "Thank you." They sat together in silence for a while, both staring at the city lights outside. The world below looked peaceful, but they both knew the kind of struggles that existed beyond the glass. He turned to her and said quietly, "You know, before you came into our lives, everything felt empty. My house, my work, even my heart. You brought life back, not just for my son, but for me too." She looked down, unsure how to respond. "You've both given me more than I ever imagined." "I should be the one thanking you." He shook his head. "You saved my son, but you also saved me from a life without meaning." For a moment the room felt still. The air between them carried a quiet understanding, something unspoken yet deeply real. She felt her chest tighten with emotion, but she simply smiled and said softly, "I'm just glad he's happy." In the following weeks, things at work became even busier. She proved herself capable of handling big responsibilities. Many people in the office admired her dedication, but not everyone was kind. A few colleagues whispered behind her back, saying she got special treatment because the boss liked her. She heard those whispers one day when she was walking by the hallway. They hurt her deeply, though she didn't show it. She returned to her desk and focused on her work, pretending everything was fine. That evening, she stayed late again. The man came by and noticed something was wrong. "Did someone upset you?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, nothing. I'm fine." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not fine. I can tell." She hesitated, then finally said, "People are talking. Think I'm here because you feel sorry for me." He frowned, his voice calm but firm. "Let them talk. The truth doesn't need defending." She nodded quietly. She didn't want to cause any trouble, but inside she wished people could see her for who she truly was. Just someone trying her best. The next morning, something unexpected happened. During a company meeting, the man publicly praised her for her work. He talked about her honesty, her bravery, and how she had earned every bit of respect she received. Everyone in the room clapped. She felt her eyes sting with tears. though she quickly blinked them away. Later, when no one was looking, she whispered to herself, "Maybe people will finally understand." Over the next few months, the company grew even more successful. The man often credited her for helping him stay grounded. She became not just an assistant, but a trusted advisor, someone whose opinion he valued deeply. One weekend, he invited her and his son to spend the day outside the city, near the countryside. It was a peaceful place with open fields and a small lake. The boy ran around happily, chasing butterflies and laughing freely. She stood by the water, watching the reflection of the sky ripple gently. The man came and stood beside her. "It's beautiful here," he said quietly. She nodded. "It feels like everything slows down here." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. I've spent years chasing success. But standing here now, I realize none of it matters without peace, without people who make life meaningful." She turned toward him, meeting his eyes. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, a kind of softness that came only when a person spoke from the heart. "I'm glad you and your son found peace," she said sincerely. He smiled. "We found it because of you." She looked away, feeling her cheeks warm. "You give me too much credit," he shook his head. "No, you don't see what you've done. You've changed us." For a while they stood there in silence, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. It was the kind of silence that didn't need words. As the sun began to set, the boy came running toward them, holding a bunch of wildflowers. "For you," he said, handing them to her with a bright smile. She took them gently, her heart swelling with affection. "They're beautiful. Thank you." The man watched the two of them together and thought to himself how lucky he was, not just because his son had been saved, but because that moment of tragedy had led him to meet someone who had quietly become the light of their lives. Later that evening, as they drove back to the city, the boy fell asleep in the back seat. The road was quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the car. The man glanced at her and said softly, "I've been thinking a lot lately about how unpredictable life is. One moment can change everything." She nodded. "I think about that too." He smiled gently. "And I think the moment that changed my life was when you ran into that fire." Her eyes filled with emotion, but she looked away, trying to steady her voice. "I didn't do it to change anyone's life. I just couldn't watch a child suffer." He nodded. "That's exactly why it changed everything. Because you acted from your heart." The conversation ended there, but the feelings behind it stayed. Neither of them said more, yet both knew something deep and real had formed between them. A bond built not on words, but on shared kindness and quiet understanding. Back at home, she placed the wildflowers in a small jar on her table. She looked at them before going to bed, smiling to herself. She thought about how far she had come, from a tired cafe worker struggling to survive, to someone who had found purpose and love in the simplest acts of courage. Life still wasn't perfect, but it was full. And that was more than she had ever hoped for. The next morning, as she arrived at work, she found a note on her desk. It was from the man. It read, "Your kindness has become the heart of everything around us. Never doubt how much you're valued." She sat there for a long time, reading the note again and again. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside her bag. It was something she knew she would keep forever. From that day on, things felt different, calmer, deeper. The bond between them grew stronger, though unspoken. And little did she know, the next chapter of her life was about to bring her something she never imagined. A moment when the man's gratitude would turn into something far greater. Something that would truly change her world forever. The days that followed felt lighter. Everything seemed to move with a quiet rhythm that made life feel peaceful. She had found balance. In her work, in her heart, and in the small everyday moments that made her feel alive. Yet deep inside, she sometimes wondered what the future held. One late afternoon, the sky was painted in soft orange light as she walked out of the office. The man called out to her, asking if she could stay for a short meeting. She smiled and agreed, unaware that this small moment would lead to something that would change her life forever. They sat in his office, papers scattered on the table. He seemed unusually quiet. After a while, he closed the folder and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said softly. She waited, curious but calm. He leaned back slightly, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You remember that day, the accident, when everything changed?" She nodded slowly. Of course. I don't think I could ever forget. He looked down for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. That day didn't just change my son's life. It changed mine too. I realized what truly matters. You reminded me that kindness still exists in a world that often forgets it. She smiled gently. Anyone would have done the same. He shook his head. No, not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger's child. You did. And since that day, I've been trying to find a way to repay you. Not with money or gifts, but with something that truly honors what you did. She frowned slightly. You don't owe me anything. You've already done so much. He looked at her, his voice steady and warm. I do owe you. Not because of the rescue, but because you brought hope back into our lives. I've watched you work, how you care for people, how you give without expecting anything. You've become part of our family. Her throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. She had never expected gratitude or recognition. She only wanted to help. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside. You know, he said quietly, I used to think that money could fix everything. But I've learned that the greatest things in life can't be bought. Trust, love, peace. And you've given all of that just by being you. She sat silently, her heart full. Then he turned back to her and said something she didn't expect. I want to start something new, a foundation, a charity for children and families in crisis. And I want you to lead it with me. Her eyes widened. Me, he nodded. Yes, you understand people. You've lived through struggle. You've seen the worst and still chosen to be kind. That's exactly the kind of heart this foundation needs. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. I don't know what to say. I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that. He smiled softly. You are more qualified than anyone I know. You've lived it. You've survived it. You've changed lives without even realizing it. She wiped her tears, trying to gather her thoughts. If this can help others the way people once helped me, then yes, I'll do it. He smiled, a real heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. Then it's decided. The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. They worked side by side, building something meaningful from the ground up. They met with families, designed programs, and visited places where help was needed the most. Everywhere they went, people were drawn to her warmth and sincerity. The little boy often came along too. He would run around with other children, laughing and sharing his toys. Watching him play freely brought tears to her eyes sometimes. He was the reason it all began, the reason their paths had crossed. The foundation grew quickly. Newspapers wrote about it, calling it a project born from an act of courage, but she never took credit. Whenever people asked her about the rescue, she only said, I was just in the right place at the right time. One day after a long event, she sat outside on the steps of the building, tired but happy. The man came and sat beside her, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her with a smile. You look exhausted, she laughed softly. Maybe a little, but it's a good kind of tired. He looked at her for a long moment, his voice gentle. You've changed so much since I first met you, she smiled. I guess life has a way of shaping us, he nodded. Yes, but you've shaped life too, and for so many others. They sat in silence, watching the city lights blink in the distance. It was peaceful. After a moment, he said, There's something else I've been meaning to tell you. She turned to him, curious. What is it? He took a deep breath. I've spent a long time thinking about what really matters, and I've realized that the people who change our lives don't always come with a warning. They just appear, quietly, unexpectedly, and before we know it, they've become everything we never knew we needed. Her heart skipped a beat. She felt the emotion in his words, raw and real. He continued softly, You came into our lives as a stranger, but now I can't imagine our lives without you. You're not just someone who saved my son. You've become the reason we smile again. She looked down, her eyes glistening. You don't have to say all this. I already know what your family means to me. He smiled faintly. I'm not saying this out of gratitude. I'm saying it because it's the truth. I care about you deeply. She felt her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something pure and overwhelming. She met his eyes and saw sincerity there, the kind that didn't need promises or fancy words. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet connection that had been growing between them since the day their lives first crossed. Finally, she said softly, "You and your son gave me a new beginning. I thought I was saving someone that day, but maybe I was the one being saved." He smiled gently. "Maybe we saved each other." The days that followed were filled with warmth and calm. They continued to work together, but something unspoken had changed between them. There was a deeper bond, built on respect, care, and the quiet gratitude that comes from shared pain turned into purpose. As time passed, their foundation helped hundreds of families. People would often ask how it all started, and every time, the man would answer the same way. It began with one brave woman who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. Whenever she heard those words, she smiled humbly, remembering how that one act of courage had not only saved a child but had rewritten her own story. Months later, the man invited her and his son for dinner. It was a small, warm gathering at home, just the three of them. After dinner, the boy handed her a small envelope. "Papa said it's something special," he said with excitement. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a single silver key. The letter read, "You once said you never felt like you belonged anywhere. This is the key to a place that will always belong to you. Your own home. A small gift for someone who gave us back our lives." Her hands trembled as she read the words. Tears rolled down her cheeks and she looked up at him speechless. He smiled, his voice soft. "You deserve stability, peace, and everything good this life can give. This is not charity. It's gratitude from my heart." She covered her mouth, trying to hold back her tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," he said. "By being who you are." The boy ran up to her and hugged her tightly. "Now you can live near us forever," he said with a bright grin. She laughed through her tears, hugging him back. "That sounds perfect." That night, as she stood outside under the stars, she realized how far she had come, from that smoky roadside where her life had almost ended, to this moment filled with warmth, family, and belonging. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure if she was thanking life, fate, or something greater. Her journey had started with fear, but it had ended with love, not the kind that comes from romance alone, but the kind that grows from kindness, trust, and the courage to care for others. And so, her story became a quiet reminder to everyone who heard it, that sometimes, one brave act can ripple through time, changing not just one life but many. That when we choose compassion over fear, we create miracles without even realizing it. She didn't become famous or rich, but she found something far more valuable, a home, a purpose, and people who truly loved her for who she was. And whenever someone asked her how it all happened, she would simply smile and say, "It all began with a moment when I chose to help."